Thank you so much, Craig. My name is Jess Evita, and I'm the Associate Director for the Margo F. Souza Student Leadership Center at UC Merced. And I'm very excited to have you all here and to talk about global skills for leadership, a topic that is so important, but especially in today's world where we have the capability to live a globalized world and have more and more teams both across the globe, but also where you're seeing more often now where we have individuals in teams, right, that where we represent more and more cultures, which is such a beautiful thing, but really speaks to the importance of global leadership. And so I'm really, really excited to introduce you to first I'll introduce you to my colleague, Jacob Kruger, who also is at the UC Merced with me, and then I'll introduce you to our speaker coming to us from Australia.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jacob Crosdale. I love thinking from new and different perspectives, and I've had plenty of opportunities to do that at UC Merced, and then traveling during college and after college. So I'm really excited to be with you, and I'm excited to kick it back to Jess, because I think our keynote speaker here, our guest speaker, is really rad. And you're going to get a lot from interacting with them. So without further ado, Jess.
Thanks, Jacob. And Jacob's going to make sure that we see you in the chat. So if you want to engage and you want to engage via the chat, feel free to, and we'll make sure that we get to you. So now I am super excited to introduce you to our guest speaker, who's going to talk more about global skills for leadership. Casey White, he's the Dean and Head of Undergraduates at St. Paul's College. He's coming to us from Sydney, Australia. So it's a bit early on Wednesday morning for Casey. So I don't think it's just hit 8 a.m. for him. So thank you so much, Casey, for working with us on the differing time zones. But Casey is an international award-winning higher education leader. He works as the Dean and Head of Undergraduates at St. Paul's College in Sydney, Australia. Previous to this, he was the General Manager for Residential Life for Unilodge Australia and New Zealand, responsible for the strategic management of 70,000 students in 75 plus residence halls across 10 universities and 10 different cities in both countries, Australia and New Zealand. Casey is published in the Asia Pacific Student Accommodation Journal and has presented at conferences and study tours across the US, Singapore, and Australia. His current research interests lie in the development of moral economy in student conduct and the emotions of student leadership. In addition to working in student affairs, Casey is an award-winning conductor and has toured his ensembles around South Africa and the US. He has been an invited conductor for several wind orchestras in Australia and was the founding bandmaster of the UL Symphonic Band. In 2018, he was bestowed the honor of becoming the cultural ambassador for his hometown of Burnie, Tasmania. So definitely diverse in his interests and his talents. I am so excited to introduce you to all my colleagues. I think we met about 5 years ago when he hosted our residential life colleagues of UCLA at the University of Sydney, and it's been wonderful to see him continue in his career and really continue as a leader, a global leader. So I'm excited to introduce you to Dean of Undergraduates at St. Paul's College in Sydney, Australia, Casey White.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jess, and everyone. I'm really excited to be here, even if it is a little early in the morning for us, but I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm really excited to talk to you all as well. I guess as a matter of kind of format, I will talk through a few bits and pieces, and if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out at any point, and we'll go from there. One thing we are going to talk about is cultural fluency, and it's important for us here in Australia. Part of our cultural fluency is recognising our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, or our First Nations peoples. And so the way that we do that is, I'm just going to say a brief acknowledgement of country. So I'd just like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on the lands on which the college that I work at, which you can see behind me here, is built, and just pay my respect to our elders past, present and emerging, and the role of leadership that they've taken before we arrived on this country as well. That being said, we've talked about, coming into this, a little bit, what do we think are 3 key things you need? There's lots of things you need in global leadership, but 3 key things that we've talked about are cultural fluency, empathy, and communication. And so I'm going to talk through a little bit of some theoretical and try and throw in a few kind of experiences of my own. I've been very fortunate in that I have travelled a fair bit. So I've been able to go to South Africa, I've been to the US, I've been to Singapore, I've been to Germany and England, New Zealand, and I've done a fair bit of travel across Australia. So even within Australia, there's even a very different way that I live in New South Wales, which is the state that I live in. But if you head over to Western Australia, which is the complete other end of the country, they have a different way of even looking at Australia. So there's a level of fluency, a cultural fluency within our own countries that we've got to do, let alone globally too. So what I want to kind of start off with is a bit of a story about one of my really good mates, Ruben. Ruben's a Dutch, he's from the Netherlands. Now, Ruben and I actually met, funnily enough, in a pub. I was there having some friends with dinner, having dinner with friends rather, and then he was over at another table kind of talking away. And I kind of just looked up and heard this, what's came across originally to me was this kind of really blunt conversation of someone was just like, no, down the line. And I was like, well, this is the kind of, is everything all right, getting heated. And they were actually having a conversation about how to cook food on a barbecue, which was just kind of this sort of innocuous little thing. But so I went over and I said, oh, hi, I just wanted to see if everything's okay, just saying hello for some reason. And then ended up sitting down having this long conversation about understanding that in Dutch culture, sometimes speaking really bluntly or really quite plainly about things is very normal and it's an accepted thing. Whereas in Australian culture, for example, if someone's really blunt or really pointed to you, you kind of go, whoa, this feels really invasive. I don't feel particularly comfortable with it. And kind of you go, it's almost jarring or feels insensitive in a way. But for him, that's very normal. That's how they speak to each other in the Netherlands. And so this is a really interesting thing that I came to learn. But how did I get to this point in terms of actually understanding that? And this is my first sort of point about cultural fluency, is asking questions. If something, you don't quite understand something or it doesn't make sense, asking questions is really important. And they don't need to be aggressive questions as, say something's kind of like, oh, I wasn't expecting that. You don't need to be going things like, well, why did you do that? That's really, that's quite aggressive in response. But asking could you tell me a little bit more about how this works? Or I don't quite understand this element, or hey, I'm really interested to learn about you as a person. There's people appreciate inquisitiveness in particular, and that's how you start to build up cultural fluencies too, is the more that you can ask and just do that. And I know when we've had exchange students in particular over here in Australia that have come from all over the world, they've been able to thrive the most when they've gone, hey, I'm not sure about this thing in Australia, or I don't understand how this works. And so that's my first point. You're never going to know everything too, and accepting that. Sometimes I've seen leaders that, particularly in a global context, they will kind of read up everything they possibly can, and that's really, really important to be informed. And learning constantly is a big thing, but it doesn't end there. So you're not going to kind of reach a point where you've read every book on Australia or every book on Europe, and then suddenly you're there and you've got this full complement. There's always going to be subtleties that aren't necessarily captured in reading books or reading things online or going in forums. They're very important to help get a base understanding, but it's going to be about the way that you interact with people and gathering your own stories as well. That's going to be important. So knowing that you won't know everything and being okay with that. Sometimes some people are very okay with ambiguity or not knowing everything. And then other times it makes you feel quite uncomfortable. And then you kind of start doubting yourself, or you get anxiety over that, or you start questioning, oh my gosh, have I made the right decision? You know, why did I do this? Why did I travel here? And that sometimes, particularly if you're just doing holiday kind of travel and you're doing it by yourself, all of these feelings can kind of rush on you at once, and you're going, oh, this is an emotional wheelhouse, and how do I kind of process this? But I'll talk about that in a minute. The emotions of leadership, or the emotions of global experiences, is something I have quite a big interest in, and kind of getting down and understanding how things feel for us. But I could be talking about that for 2 weeks, so I won't go too far into that today. But understanding that, yeah, you're not going to know everything, that's a good point. And in that, it's making sure that your own ego doesn't kind of get in the way of not knowing everything, and just being willing to accept that you might not have the full grip on a situation globally, and in a leadership context too, particularly if you've come on exchange, or you've gone overseas, and then you're thrust into a position in a country, or you've decided to step up on a campus leadership role, for example, and then you're trying to navigate being in another country, trying to navigate how that works, you know, things like different pay systems, different language, all of that stuff. So just making sure that you're not kind of holding on to any of your own ego and or your initial impressions of something, because they can hold you back in terms of being open and being able to do that. And probably my last kind of key point in terms of cultural fluency is around understanding your own context that you're operating in too. So there are key things that you should learn. In particular, in Australia, we are quite sarcastic people in the way that we kind of talk, and we make a lot of self-deprecating jokes about ourselves. And if you've never kind of experienced that as well, it can be quite overwhelming. And I've gotten tripped up before where we kind of just say things that are intended as funny, and someone's kind of stopped and looked at me and gone, oh, what did you mean by that? And not quite understood. And that's what I mean by knowing your context. It's being present in the exact situation that you're in. So you can go, I'm talking, and I can see from the body language on their face, or they've suddenly gone from, oh, I'm really relaxed, to they've just kind of tensed up a little bit, and you're going, oh, okay, the tone of our conversation or the tone of our interaction here has started to just shift that little bit. And so it's kind of they can be micro changes in the context that you're in immediately. And then that is a nice cue for you to go, oh, I don't quite understand what you said, or could you explain to me the joke, or something like that. And that can make you feel quite vulnerable too, because you can feel like you're not necessarily a part of the group. But if you're open to that, people can be open back to you. And so it's this kind of reciprocal openness is something that I've talked about with students as well. So they're my kind of key thoughts in that cultural fluency, global fluency sort of space as well. Our second key thought that we were talking about is empathy, and understanding empathy too. And I think the current kind of global climate, with COVID-19, has stretched a lot of people's empathy. It's kind of thrust people into just having to understand situations. You know, it's different in every country. We're in a different spot here in Australia to the US, and we were talking briefly about Europe before. They're in a very different situation to us too. We've got one state in particular here in Australia, down in Victoria, that's just come out of total lockdown yesterday, and they were told originally they'd be locked down for 6 weeks, and it ended up being 4.5 months. So there are some people down there that have not left their house in 4 months. They've just not been allowed on the street. And so that, for me, here in Sydney, my lifespan relatively hasn't actually changed that much. I mean, I'm fortunate, I live on our university campus as well. So my house is about a minute and a half's walk to my office. So my normal life really hasn't been that disrupted. But talking to people, and again, this comes back to that fluency in terms of asking questions around, tell me about your experience down in Victoria. You've been locked. How does that feel to be stuck in such a small space, and just getting their stories and collecting stories is really important too. Sharpen your empathy edge, as someone said to me once before. And some key kind of things in terms of understanding your empathy or understanding empathy for others. A really first important point is practice what we call practice presence. If you are kind of having a conversation with somebody, or you're trying to understand them, but you know, if take this pen, for example, if that's the person, but you're kind of doing this, you know, kind of half talking to them, but you're, oh yes, something very exciting is kind of going on over there. You're not being present. And if you feel scattered or you don't feel connected, you're not going to be able to empathize or understand their situation. And something really good, if you do struggle, I tend to have a bit of a personality that kind of, I can get quite excited. I like to jump around lots of different things at once. Just taking a minute or two every day to practice some meditation or some grounding, and just to be able to find a really good practice in terms of, okay, I can single in on this. And that's good for empathy. I mean, it's also good for studying for exams and doing assignments and other things like that. But in terms of empathy, being able to just solely focus on the person in front of you is really, really good. And these kind of, there's some overlap here with what I was talking around in fluency, but in empathy, listening more and acknowledging the other person, listening more and staying humble. Sometimes empathetic leadership actually requires restraint on your own part. And I mean that in that sometimes someone says something and we want to help. And so we try to launch in and give them a solution, or we try to say, oh, you know, this thing, but sometimes we just need to let the person get everything out, and then they've been able to verbalize it themselves, and then they can go, okay, now that I've kind of heard that out loud, it's not sort of rambling around my head. Here's some things I instantly can do, or other questions, and then you can step in and help that way. And you can help draw patterns from that kind of information. And that is part of a servant leadership mindset as well, which is a little bit different to what I'm talking about here. But servant leadership, if you are quite fascinated with leadership and leadership theory, is really worth digging into at some point too. My other thing about sort of sharpening your empathy edge here is exploring with imagination. So that's just consuming lots of different things in the context that you're in, but not keeping it within your own group too, being open to lots of different experiences from different people in different ways. Something that just anecdotally sometimes I think can happen is on an exchange perspective, sometimes we have big groups of people that come from one country, and then they come over here and they just stick to the people from their own country. And it's good, don't get me wrong, it's really good to have people that you feel comfortable with and that, but then they end up spending their 6 months or 12 months on exchange, and they haven't really experienced anybody else. They've just kind of stuck with their own people. And so having the imagination or the curiosity of exploration, and that's in the setting that you're in terms of, say you came to Sydney, there's so much going on in the city of Sydney, let alone the rest of Australia. But then there's so many different things that happen on campus. And I'm sure, you know, you guys are reaching out and doing lots of different things on your own campus. So I think it's really good to, if you've got that innate curiosity or interest there, make sure you work out how you can translate that or do that. And I get it, sometimes not everyone's as big and as extroverted as I am, and that can be quite overwhelming. But sometimes it's about just a little step for yourself too. So measuring your own success in terms of how things are going there is very individual too. And my last point, my last 2 points, because I know that we've only got 30 minutes and I could kind of keep going and going on this stuff in terms of empathy is get down in the trenches. So you should never kind of consider an experience that's kind of not worthwhile, particularly from a leader perspective, to help you just continue to expand your understanding. And getting in the trenches is having conversations with people, doing fun things. Some of my greatest experiences with friends of mine from overseas, in particular, we had this amazing German exchange student when I was an undergraduate who took us. He knew of this little German settlement town in Adelaide, which is in South Australia, another state, and called Harndorf. And I'd never heard of it, wasn't kind of really on the map, but he knew about it. It's up in the Adelaide Hills. And that was this amazing experience because it was this kind of little transplant of Germany in Australia. And he came through, and because of just this conversation we'd had about trying to understand German culture and how it works, that we all ended up over there. And now you can't see it on my shelf that's actually over there on the wall. There are these just really cute little artifacts that we bought while we were there, but each of them then has a story. And so if it wasn't for kind of getting down and actually being around each other and talking to each other, and that those things never would have happened. And then the last thing is finding common ground. If something that I actually struggled with as an undergraduate was when I was meeting people, how can I find things that we have in common? And so a tool that I personally found useful was think up 4 or 5 questions that when you're meeting someone that you can just kind of keep in the back of your mind if they don't come to you naturally or it's not really quick. And that was the best tool that I had. And they don't need to be the same things in terms of, what are you studying, where are you from, all of that. But there's lots of things. I have to wear an academic gown at a number of functions for the university. And I have a series of pins that I put on my academic gown specifically. And the number of just students that kind of see these pins and they go, oh, tell me about your pins. And then bang, I've got this straight in. And then I've got one from the Walt Disney Ears for the Arts Foundation. And so that opens up an opportunity for me to go, do you like Disney movies? And they say, oh, no, not really, but I like Pixar stuff. And so then we've got this great conversation about Pixar. Then we're talking about superheroes. And then all of a sudden we're talking about, okay, well, what's the character of a superhero like and all of that stuff. So set yourself up for success, I guess, is the key point in terms of finding common ground by just thinking through it a little bit before you have to step into that situation. And then lastly is communication. Communication is ultimately the crux of so many different things. But just the kind of home point I really want to drive with communication is knowing yourself and knowing how you interact. One of the best things that I personally ever did was I did a Gallup strengths test, and that was just profoundly insightful. And I finally kind of had this dawning moment of, so this is why I react to that way. Or when someone speaks to me, because my strengths and the way that I think are predominantly strategic, yet someone's over here doing, one of my really good mates, my bottom skill is his top skill. And so us as a kind of a unit working together goes really well. But that's my thing. Know yourself, know what's going to trigger you, so that in communication, it's not just talking, it's not just writing, it's the non-verbal stuff. Non-verbal communication is huge, particularly in a global context, because as I was talking about before, you might be in a conversation and suddenly someone's body language goes from being really wide open and excited to it shuts right down, and you've gone, okay, something we've said or done here isn't right. And so I'm sure the guys at the Leadership Center here would have, if you haven't accessed that, they would have ample ways to just start to learn yourself if you haven't, or maybe you've got some insight already. And part of that too is having a bit of feedback from people on, hey, what do I do well when I communicate and what do I not do well as well. So there are our key 3 points. I kind of talked for 20 minutes there, but throw it open if anyone has any questions or anything like that.
Thank you, Casey. So just to summarize, Casey talked about empathy, communication, and cultural fluency as three very, very important skills for leadership, but especially global leadership. So I wanted to hear, does anyone have any questions for Casey about these three skills and the different aspects of these leadership skills that he shared with us? You can feel free to put it in the chat, or if you just want to use your audio, that's also fine. Okay, wonderful. You must have covered it all, Casey. Oh. Every little aspect of it. We are running out of time. I want to thank everyone who is here today. We have again, my name's Jess, and we have Jacob from the UC Merced, Margo Souza Student Leadership Center. You'll also notice we have Margo here as well. Hey, Margo. Craig from UC Merced Study Abroad. Thank you, Craig, for bringing us all together. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Casey, for bringing your perspective and sharing with us the important skills that we need for leadership, especially global leadership, now more than ever. We really, really appreciate your time, and we're definitely grateful, and good luck with everything happening in Australia. We hope you all stay safe. And I wanted to see if Craig had any housekeeping for us before we wrap up.
Nothing related to the content itself, but just know that as registrants, I should have your email addresses, and I do hope by the middle of next week to have a recording up and available in case you would like to review this content again.
And we do have a question in the chat.
Yeah, from Jennifer. Jennifer, that's a wonderful question. I'll try and kind of answer it quickly if I can. How do you share about yourself without taking over the conversation? I think when I was talking about having that little set of questions you can ask, and it's just keeping it in mind that, oh, am I talking too much? Am I not? And you can it's part of the non-verbal communication skills. If someone's kind of starting to feel like there's probably too much that's being said, or you're kind of going on and on, and they can you can sense or see that their focus is shifting a little bit, it might be worth throwing back a question to them. But everything's in balance, right? So if you can just keep in mind, I've got to balance my conversation, particularly if you're someone who just loves talking, which is totally fine. That's how I do it. Just a conscious thought about keeping balance.
Jennifer writes, thank you. Any additional questions? Oh yes, and Jess just shared a handout for all of us, a takeaway. Do you have any context for that, Jess?
Yes, I just wanted to share, I wanted to give you some concrete definitions to allow you to review the 3 leadership skills that we find are very important. And I want to highlight that you'll notice in the document, we do state that there's so many leadership skills. There are an endless list of leadership skills that are important for leadership in general, but global leadership especially. And so these are just 3 that we think are especially important and can really help with your leadership, regardless of your context. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Yes, thank you all for joining.